What's up everyone and welcome back to the World History Channel. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button today. Let's get started. Who was Merlin the Great really? The background can be found here. Medieval writers transformed tales of an obscure bard into legends of a mighty wizard who put King Arthur on the throne of Camelot. Wise old men with magical powers and sometimes long hoary beards are the archetypal wizards. These mystical men possess magical powers that can be used for good or evil. And literature is full of them. Prospero, the central character in Shakespeare's The Tempest, is the exiled Duke of Milan who obtains magical powers when marooned on an island. The main character in L. Frank Baum's 1900 novel The Wonderful Wizard of Oz and the 1939 film based upon it reigns as the Emerald City's mysterious magical ruler. The pipe-smoking Gandalf the Grey is a benevolent and powerful advisor in J.R.R. The Lord of the Rings trilogy by Tolkien from the 1950s. And of course there's the benevolent Albus Dumbledore, headmaster of the wizarding school Hogwarts in the 1990s Harry Potter series of books, who uses his powers for the greater good. But there's one wizard, Merlin the Great, who is the inspiration for them all. Since his first appearance in medieval literature, he has evolved over many centuries, transforming from a Welsh bard to a shape-shifting sorcerer. As one of the most compelling characters in the Arthurian legend, he is at its core. Dark origins. The very first Merlin was not a wizard. Sources from the Middle Ages speak of a Welsh bard or poet from the 6th century, Merlin W., who lived in the court of Gwendolew, the king of the Welsh-speaking territories of southern Scotland and northern England. According to the narrative, Merlin is enraged when Gwendolew dies at the Battle of Arthurhyd in 573. He flees to the forests of Scotland, where he lives for the next 50 years as a wild hermit, expressing himself through cryptic verses and acquiring the gift of prophecy. In the Celtic tradition, bards and poets are linked to forecasting the future. The poem Arms Pridean, the Prophecy of Britain, written in the 10th century, depicts Merlin W. as a prophet who foretells how an alliance between Celts and Vikings from Northern Ireland would drive the Anglo-Saxons out of Britain. Emerging magician. In the writings of Welsh author Geoffrey of Monmouth from the 12th century, Merlin took on a more familiar form. He made Merlin a central figure in his 3 books, Prophecies of Merlin, the poem Life of Merlin, and most famously, The History of the Kings of Britain, skillfully revising the Welsh tradition. While the main character of Life of Merlin resembles Merlin W. of the Welsh tradition, the new Merlin appears in Prophecies, which is included in Book 7 of Geoffrey's history. King Arthur is granted the opportunity to ascend to the throne of England by this revised version, a powerful sorcerer. Geoffrey drew inspiration for this character from the 9th century Welsh monk Nennius's The History of the Britons. Nennius's book tells the story of the evil King Vortigern, a usurper of the throne, who allowed the Saxons to settle on the island of Britain. Vortigern wants to build a castle, but every time he tries, the foundations disappear. His magicians tell him the only way to secure them is to find a fatherless boy, sacrifice him, and bathe the foundations in his blood. So they capture a boy, Ambrosius Merlin, the son of a nun who claims to be a virgin. The young man confronts the magicians and claims that 2 giant worms, one red and the other white, reside under the castle's shaky foundations and are locked in combat. According to Ambrosius, their dispute is a harbinger of conflict between Britons and Saxons. Demon's son. Geoffrey blended the character of Merlin, about whom little had been written at that point, with young Ambrosius from Nennius's story, enriching the narration with new details. Despite the fact that Merlin's mother is still a nun, the child is conceived by an incubus, a male demon. Medieval people believed demons were cleverer than humans and could predict the course of events. In Geoffrey's work, Merlin inherits these qualities, which he uses for the good. Geoffrey of Monmouth combined the characteristics of seership from pagan mythology with a promotion of Christian values, creating a unique blend of historical and legendary elements. Geoffrey transforms the 2 fighting worms into 2 fighting dragons, one red and one white, for a further distinction. Merlin explains the red dragon represents the Britons and the white dragon represents the Saxons, who will ultimately achieve victory. In this prophecy, he essentially predicts the early days of the Arthurian narrative. But he doesn't stop there. Merlin presents 100 or so prophecies in all, including Arthur's dominance and the course of England's unforeseeable future. The success of Geoffrey's new Merlin inspired Was, an Anglo-Norman author who lived on both sides of the English Channel, to translate the history into his own language. The result was the Roman de Brut, a nearly 15,000-line poem in Norman French completed around 1155. Many people believe that it was part of an oral tradition long before Round Table appeared in writing. The Roman de Brut is not simply a translation. Was changed the material to his liking. For example, he removed Merlin's prophecies. His justification for this was that many passages were incomprehensible, although he possibly wanted to avoid their political nature. Merlin at the court of King Arthur in the 12th or 13th century. The author Robert de Boron introduced a brand new narrative development to the story of Merlin. Inspired by Was, he composed his Merlin in verse, but only fragments of that work survive to the present. The text was later retold in prose around 1210, perhaps by Boron himself, and thanks to that, the poem's contents have been preserved. The first scene of Boron's work features a cleric named Blaise, who is determined to write about Merlin and explains that he is translating a Latin story that Merlin himself dictated. After this introduction, the scene changes, and the reader learns that at Merlin's birth, a council of demons are conspiring to turn the baby into a kind of anti-Christ, their agent on earth. Their plans fail because the child is baptized by his mother and becomes a Christian, even though he is the son of an incubus. Merlin is a positive character, despite his demonic birth and some aspects that link him to pre-Christian magic, such as the ability to shapeshift change his physical form at will. Vortigern then reappears on de Boron's text, and his death is foretold by Merlin. The wizard fights against the Saxon invaders alongside the new King Pendragon and his brother Uther. Merlin erects Stonehenge in honor of the fallen and creates the Round Table. It is also Merlin who causes Uther and Yern, the Duke of Cornwall's wife, to meet. Their union results in the birth of Arthur, whom Merlin will mentor. In the end, Arthur pulls a sword from a stone to claim the British crown. Merlin would continue to evolve from his depiction in de Boron's work, which laid the full foundation for the rest of the works to come about King Arthur and Camelot. In the 15th century, Sir Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur, Death of Arthur, written in English about 1470, retells the Arthurian legend in chronological sequence beginning with Arthur's birth. Portrayed as Arthur's mentor who's instrumental in every aspect of his life, Malory's Merlin is the culmination of all other versions of the powerful wizard. The metamorphosis of Merlin. The magic of Merlin continued to inspire different portrayals of the character across many different genres well into the modern age. Mark Twain portrayed Merlin as a swindler in his novel, A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, 1889. French poet and filmmaker Jean Cocteau turned Merlin the magician into a cruel and manipulate old man in The Knights of the Round Table, 1937. One of the most memorable works appeared in 1960. The Broadway musical Camelot, based on the British writer T.H. The Once and Future King, a 1958 book and white series, introduces Merlin as a bumbling but wise teacher who inspires young Arthur to think for himself. Many films have been based on the Arthurian legend, including John Boorman's grandiose Excalibur 1981, showcasing Nicol Williamson's campy Merlin. There's also the British satire Monty Python and the Holy Grail 1975, in which there is no Merlin at all, or is he the pyromaniac wizard Tim the Enchanter? Beginning in 2008, Merlin appeared on BBC One as a fantasy adventure drama. Recognizing the Arthur legend had been done to death, this popular show presents Merlin in a coming-of-age story as unpolished but lovable as he learns to be a sorcerer. Familiar elements include Excalibur, Guinevere, and Lancelot, but admittedly, it's a long way from the original Arthurian legend. Who was Merlin the Great? The rise and fall of a legend from bard to wizard. The image of Merlin, the wise, bearded wizard guiding King Arthur to his destiny, has become one of the most enduring archetypes in Western literature. Merlin has been reimagined as a prophet, a shapeshifter, the son of a demon, and the architect of Camelot in everything from medieval chronicles to contemporary fantasy. However, Merlin, a Welsh bard who was driven mad by war in the 6th century, and whose prophetic verses and tragic fate were gradually transformed into the story of a powerful enchanter, lies far older and more complex than the legend. The evolution of Merlin from a historical or semi-historical figure into a mythic symbol of magic and power reveals how legends are shaped by politics, religion, and the human need for heroes and mystics who can alter the course of destiny. 1. The Dark Origins. Merlin the Wild Prophet. The earliest incarnation of Merlin appears not as a wizard, but as a madman and poet in the Welsh tradition. Merlin the Wild was a bard in the court of King Gwendolew, a ruler of the Old North, southern Scotland and northern England, during the 6th century. According to Welsh lore, Merlin fought at the Battle of Arthurhead, 573 AD, a brutal conflict between rival British kings. When Gwendolew was slain, Merlin was driven insane by grief and fled into the forests of Celadon, modern-day Scotland, where he lived as a wild hermit, prophesying doom in cryptic poetry. The madness of Merlin. In poems like Aphilena, the apple trees, and Hoyana, the greetings, Merlin describes his torment, haunted by visions of the dead and the future. His verses, filled with natural imagery and apocalyptic warnings, reflect the Celtic tradition of bards as seers, men whose words could shape fate. Prophecies of Britain. The 10th century Welsh poem Arms Prydian, The Prophecy of Britain, casts Merlin as a nationalist visionary, predicting a Celtic resurgence against the Anglo-Saxon invaders. This political undercurrent would later be amplified in Merlin's legends. 2. Geoffrey of Monmouth's reinvention. From bard to sorcerer. The transformation of Merlin into Merlin the magician began with Geoffrey of Monmouth, a 12th century cleric whose works blended history, myth, and outright invention. His Historia Regum Britanniae, which is titled History of the Kings of Britain, circa 1136, Geoffrey merged Merlin with another figure, Ambrosius Aurelianus, a boy prophet from an older Welsh tale. The boy without a father. The tyrant Vortigern is told by his magicians in Nennius's Historia Brittonum, 9th century, that only the blood of a child without a father can stabilize his crumbling tower. The chosen boy, Ambrosius, reveals that the tower's foundations are undermined by 2 battling dragons, one red, symbolizing the Britons, and one white, the Saxons. Geoffrey adapted this story, renaming the boy Merlin Ambrosius and giving him demonic ancestry. The demon's son. Geoffrey's Merlin is born to a nun seduced by an incubus, a malevolent spirit. This infernal lineage explains his supernatural gifts, prophecy, shape-shifting, and immense wisdom, while his baptism ensures he uses them for good. Political prophecies. In the Prophecies of Merlin, a standalone text later incorporated into his Historia, Geoffrey has Merlin foretell the rise of King Arthur, the fall of the Saxons, and even events in Geoffrey's own time. These prophecies were veiled political satire meant to appease Norman patrons and Geoffrey. 3. Merlin as the architect of King Arthur in the French romances. By the late 12th century, Merlin's legend had crossed into French literature, where he became inextricably linked to King Arthur's birth and reign. Wass's Roman de Brute, 1155. This Norman-French adaptation of Geoffrey's Historia downplayed Merlin's prophecies, likely to avoid political controversy, but introduced the Round Table, a symbol of unity that Merlin would later be credited with creating. Robert de Boron's Merlin c. 1200. In this verse romance, later expanded in prose, Merlin's story gains Christian overtones. A council of demons tries to make him an antichrist, but his baptism thwarts their plans. Boron also cemented Merlin's role in Stonehenge's being built. It was magically transported from Ireland, orchestrating Arthur's birth, using magic to disguise Uther Pendragon as Gorlois, Igraine's husband, designing the Round Table as a holy relic tied to the Grail quest. 4. Enchanter, lover, and prisoner are the later legends. As Arthurian romances proliferated, Merlin's character grew more complex and tragic. The Vulgate Cycle, 13th century. This French prose series deepened Merlin's duality, a Christian prophet yet a pagan shapeshifter. It also introduced his doomed love for Nimue, Vivian, the Lady of the Lake, who seals him in a magical prison, a cave or crystal tomb. Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur, 1485. Malory streamlined Merlin's role, focusing on his mentorship of Arthur and his grim fate, trapped by Nimue after revealing too many secrets. 5. Merlin's legacy. From medieval sage to modern icon, the development of Merlin continued well into the Middle Ages. Over centuries, he has been reimagined as a Renaissance magus. In works like The Prophecies of Merlin, 1498, he became a symbol of occult knowledge. A Victorian sage, Tennyson's Idylls of the King, 1859, portrayed him as a tragic figure, undone by his own wisdom. A pop culture wizard, from White's 1958 novel The Once and Future King to BBC's Merlin, 2008, and Excalibur, 1981, Merlin is still a staple of Arthuriana, sometimes funny, sometimes dark, but always magical. Conclusion. Why Merlin endures. Merlin's journey, from a mad Welsh bard to Arthur's all-powerful mentor, reflects humanity's timeless fascination with figures who straddle the line between wisdom and madness, divine and demonic, history and myth. He is a mirror for every era, a political propagandist for Geoffrey, a courtly magician for the French, a tragic lover for Mallory, and a postmodern anti-hero today. Yet at his core, Merlin remains what he was in the wilds of Celadon, a voice of prophecy, warning us that destiny is never simple, and magic, like history, is always being rewritten. Merlin's development from a mad prophet to an Arthurian architect, one of the most enduring archetypes in Western mythology, is the figure of Merlin, who is shrouded in mystery, uses ancient magic, and leads King Arthur to his destiny. Yet the Merlin we know today, the wise old wizard of Camelot, is the product of centuries of storytelling blending history, legend, and political propaganda. His origins trace back not to a mighty sorcerer, but to a mad Welsh bard named Merlin, a man driven to insanity by war and grief. By combining pagan mysticism and Christian philosophy, medieval authors transformed this obscure figure into a demonic prophet, a shape-shifting enchanter, and the architect of Arthur's reign. The result was a character that would inspire a generation of wizards, from Gandalf to Dumbledore. Merlin, the madman of the forest, 6th century. The first Merlin appears in the wild forests of post-Roman Britain, not in the glittering courts of Camelot. Merlin, also known as Merlin the Wild, was a bard in King Gwendolen's court. He was in charge of the Welsh-speaking kingdoms in northern England and southern Scotland. His tale is one of madness and tragedy. The Battle of Arthuriad, 573 AD. After witnessing the death of his king in this brutal conflict between rival British rulers, Merlin lost his mind. Fleeing into the Caledonian forest, he lived as a wild hermit, composing cryptic poetry that foretold doom and redemption. The Celtic bardic tradition. In Welsh and Scottish lore, bards were more than poets. They were seers whose words could shape reality. Like the predictions in the poem Arms Prydean, which was written in the 10th century, Merlin's prophecies envisioned a Celtic uprising against the Anglo-Saxon invaders that combined political optimism with mystical fervor. 2. Geoffrey of Monmouth's reinvention. 12th century. The birth of Merlin the magician. The transformation from Merlin to Merlin began with Geoffrey of Monmouth, a Welsh cleric whose Historia Regum Britanniae 1136 blended history, myth, and outright invention. Geoffrey merged Merlin with another figure, Ambrosius Aurelianus, a boy prophet from an older Welsh tale, to create a new kind of sorcerer, the fatherless boy and the dragons. In Geoffrey's version, the tyrant Vortigern is told that only the blood of a fatherless child can stabilize his crumbling tower. The chosen boy, renamed Merlin Ambrosius, reveals that the tower's foundations are undermined by two battling dragons, one red, the Britons, and one white, the Saxons. This scene, adapted from Nennius's Historia Brittonum, became a cornerstone of Arthurian lore. The demon's son. Geoffrey added a shocking twist. Merlin's mother was a nun seduced by an incubus, a malevolent spirit. This infernal lineage explained his supernatural gifts, prophecy, shape-shifting, while his baptism ensured he used them for good, a clever fusion of pagan magic and Christian morality. Political prophecies. Geoffrey's prophecies of Merlin, which were later incorporated into the Historia, depicted Merlin as a nationalist visionary and predicted Arthur's rise and the British victory. These prophecies were veiled political satire meant to please Norman patrons of Geoffrey. 3. The French romances. Merlin as Arthur's architect, 12th to 13th centuries. As Merlin's legend spread to France, he became inextricably linked to King Arthur's birth and reign. The Round Table was introduced in Wasse's Roman de Brut, 1155, a Norman-French adaptation of Geoffrey's Historia that downplayed Merlin's prophecies likely to avoid political controversy. Robert de Boron's Merlin c. 1200. In this verse romance, later expanded in prose, Merlin's story gained Christian overtones. His baptism thwarted a council of demons' attempt to make him an antichrist. Boron also cemented Merlin's role in Stonehenge is being built. It was magically transported from Ireland. Orchestrating Arthur's birth, using magic to disguise Uther as Gorlois, Igraine's husband. Creating the Round Table as a holy relic tied to the Grail quest. 4. The Vulgate Cycle and Malory. Merlin's tragic end, 13th to 15th centuries. Merlin's story had become more sinister by the 13th century. The Vulgate Cycle. This French prose series introduced Nimue, Vivian, the Lady of the Lake, who trapped Merlin in a cave or crystal tomb, a punishment for his lust and hubris. Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur. 1485. Malory streamlined Merlin's role, focusing on his mentorship of Arthur and his grim fate, ensnared by his own magic. V. Merlin's legacy. From medieval sage to modern icon, the development of Merlin continued well into the Middle Ages. Over centuries, he has been reimagined as a Renaissance magus. In occult texts, he became a symbol of esoteric knowledge. A Victorian sage. Tennyson's Idylls of the King, 1859, portrayed him as a tragic figure, undone by his own wisdom. A pop culture wizard. From Titch White's The Once and Future King, 1958, to BBC's Merlin, 2008, Merlin remains a fixture of Arthuriana, sometimes comic, sometimes dark, but always magical. Conclusion. Why Merlin endures. Merlin's journey, from a mad Welsh bard to Arthur's all-powerful mentor, reflects humanity's timeless fascination with figures who straddle the line between wisdom and madness, divine and demonic, history and myth. He is a mirror for every era, a political propagandist for Geoffrey, a courtly magician for the French, a tragic lover for Malory, and a postmodern antihero today. But at his core, Merlin is still the same person he was in Celadon's wilds. A prophetic voice telling us that destiny is never easy and that magic, like history, is always changing.